It was news that came so much sooner than expected. 5 years ago, on a Friday night, out at a pub with friends after seeing a show, I received word that my father had died suddenly that afternoon. I wrestled with what to do there. In the moment, I couldn't quite decide if I wanted to be among friends or if I would rather be alone. Emotions flooded through me as I grew increasingly numb. Our bodies can serve us so well sometimes when heartache strikes. In the end, I stayed put and waited on my veggie burger to arrive. Eventually, conversation around the table drifted to more mundane matters, though my mind remained in a very different place. Part of what made the experience so odd for me was that I really had no memories to return to. I had no relationship to speak of with my biological father. He and my mother had divorced by the time I was a year old, and my mother had been given full custody. Though my mother and stepfather made clear from a very young age that I had another father and could meet him whenever I wished, it's an invitation that never quite felt safe enough to accept. So it wasn't until I was 26 that we actually did meet. It was a brief encounter lasting only an hour or two. Our conversation was stilted. We seemed to have very few areas of common interest. Most vivid in my memory, aside from being shocked that he had a full head of gray hair by the age I am now, which puts my persistent little white patch in some new perspective, is that he seemed confused by my apparent inability to carry on much of a conversation about football or baseball. And he didn't seem to understand my attempt at humor when I quipped that I was more into watching women's figure skating and men's gymnastics. Still, the news of his death hit me pretty hard, and I quickly decided that I would go to his funeral. On one hand, I knew this was likely to be the best and last chance I would ever have to better understand the man who had played a pivotal part in bringing me into the world. Now, the funeral was straight out of something you would read in a Southern Gothic novel. I had made clear to his family, a group largely comprised of his siblings, that I wanted to keep a low profile. I explained that I would sit at the back of the church and that I simply needed space to take in the service and the experience itself. But that plan did not work out too well. Though we were strangers to one another, his family deferred to me as the oldest child to decide whether we would delay the start of the service for the arrival of one of my two half-sisters, siblings I had only learned about 2 days before. Eventually, the minister in me knew that the service had to get underway. The church was full of people who were waiting, many of whom likely needed to get back to work later that afternoon. I told the family I thought we needed to begin, and so the funeral director ushered the families to the front rows, and I took my seat in the back pew. Halfway through the service, the woman I assumed to be my sister finally arrived, and she made her way down the aisle to sit with the family up at the front. An animated conversation broke out in the front pew, and then, to my horror, my aunts and sisters turned around, all looking expectantly in my direction. I tried to look away. I tried to pretend I did not see their inviting gestures. But before I knew it, my sister had bounded to the back of the church and was dragging me to the front. And yes, this was the first time we had met, making our way up the aisle during our father's funeral. So it seemed rude, if not impossible, to protest this turn of events. I wasn't given a chance to explain myself. I felt I had no opportunity to insist on what I most needed at that very awkward and public moment. Now, this being a Southern-style funeral, the coffin was open, and as is the custom, most everyone in attendance filed past and then offered their condolences to the family. It was truly surreal. I had suddenly been cast in the role of this man's child, a role that was, even by the most generous assessment, highly complicated. But I shook hundreds of hands and accepted people's kindness as best I could. As the service came to a close, everyone left the church and took their places in their cars for the procession to the cemetery. The funeral director indicated that my sister and I could have as much time as we needed alone in the church before the casket was closed. My sister and I had a difficult conversation, but intimate conversation, standing there over the body of this man who was our common bond, but who neither of us had been particularly close to. Again, though, my minister mind knew that we needed to keep things going, and so I nodded to the funeral director after a few moments, who moved in and closed the lid, with me being the last person to take in the image of my father. Pallbearers moved the coffin to the hearse. My sister and I took our places with family in the front limousine. When we arrived at the cemetery on that hot June afternoon, there was a brief graveside ceremony. The coffin was lowered into the ground as final prayers were said. Eventually, everyone else drifted away, leaving only me and one of my father's sisters. As the cemetery workers began their work, we each dropped a rose on top of the casket, and there we stood until the grave was filled. It is a practice of mine to always remain at a grave until it is covered. As a minister, I feel a sacred obligation to see people to their final rest and to stay until the very end. And though I have carried out that sacred task countless times now, never had it been so impactful for me, this ritual. For this time, it was deeply personal in a way it had never been before. Seeing the body of my father buried has been one of the most powerful experiences of my life. Watching the remains of one of my parents being lowered into the ground and covered over felt like one of the most profound and primal experiences one can possibly have. As I left the reception that afternoon and began the long journey back home, tears flowed from places I did not know existed within me. I grieved the loss of what was. I grieved the loss of what never was. And even more, I mourned for what I then knew would never be. Such is the painful dance that any of us does with the grave. When our grief for loved ones lost leaves us and our world forever changed, as we relinquish outstanding dreams, as we contend with possible feelings of regret for things left undone and words left unsaid, as we reckon with the deep finality of death for them and for ourselves. Engaging the world of grief is such an important part of living an examined life, for no one avoids it, at least for very long, and certainly not forever. To be alive means to come to terms with loss one way or another, to confront the ache of having those we love be with us no more. And yet, grief can also be such a strange and generous teacher. Over these past 5 years, I have been amazed and deeply comforted at times by the relationship that has astoundingly continued with my father. With the passage of time, as I have absorbed the stories from his life, I have come to a deeper understanding of who he was, of what he was contending with, of what his gifts were, and of what demons he had to battle. At his funeral, I learned that when he died, he was carrying a photograph of me. Even with him gone, there has been healing of a wound that has been with me since I was a toddler. And even though it had been some 16 years since we had talked, even though he had never responded to my letter coming out to him, even though I had misunderstood, at least on some level, his many years of silence. Today, I keep a photo of him on my desk at home. I notice him almost every day. And while I've never actually talked to his photo, there is a sort of conversation that has unfolded between us over the years. 2 Sundays ago, we celebrated here the life of Vicki Sanderson's mother, Catherine. As people were sharing during the service, a friend of Vicki's explained that though she had never met Catherine, after hearing stories of her life, she was coming to appreciate the many ways that she sees evidence of Catherine living on in and through Vicki and her children. When I asked Vicki if I could share that story today, I explained that I wanted to do so because I felt it so powerfully speaks to the question of where each of us comes from. Where do we come from? We come from the stars. We are of stardust made. We are the strand of being passed through eons. We are the link in the long chain of life passed through complicated generation after complicated generation. We carry within us relationships that have borne the burden of human struggle and the joy of human being, all of it culminating in me and you and you and you. The poet Mary Fegan writes, I am a millions of years old wonder. I am an international, no cosmic treasure. I ought to be safeguarded in a museum somewhere like Paganini's old violin. I ought to be gasped at, talked about in hushed, amazed, reverential tones. Viewers would touch me gently and feel lucky. Daily newspaper headlines could say, Mary Fegan exists again today. Radio and TV shows could discuss me, my ordinary events. That I saw a bluebird with my millions of years old eyes and heard it sing with my highly advanced evolutionary ears. That my graceful hands with opposable thumbs fed my sensitive mouth delicious strawberries that it tasted. Then, without a conscious thought, my brilliant brain directed my masterful, complex digestive system to assimilate and use them for fuel, to wash dishes, write poems, hold babies, laugh, and give kisses. No one would completely understand or dare to finally say how my marvelous, magical, famous, fine self exists, really. I am just, bottom line, a millions of years old wonder, and you are too. As I stood over my father's grave, it was this awareness that overwhelmed me. The link of life that had led to me lay there before me, dust to dust, ashes to ashes. And yet, sad as I was, standing there filled with grief, I also felt deeply, deeply blessed. I felt knitted into the universe in a way I never had. The stardust passed to me at birth was mine to do with what I would and could. While that had always been true, I was newly aware of how true it was and is. May the same be true for each of us. As we examine our lives, may we come to know from whence we've come. May we reconnect with the stars that gave us birth through the very people who gave us life. May we allow the best of them to shine on through us, that the pulse of ancient stars through our lives will give light to ages still to come. Amen.